They called the end of all things Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, the fire that swallows the world, and the sea that swallows the fire. Everyone knows that final act. Thor battling the serpent, Odin facing the wolf, the sky torn apart, and the earth sinking into darkness. But fewer remember what came before. The long centuries when myths whispered of smaller battles, forgotten bargains, hidden children, and secret betrayals. The tales that never reached the sagas we memorize today, but lived in songs, riddles, and fragments carried on the northern wind. According to the Norse skalds, the end was only the climax of a far greater story. A story where serpents and wolves were not yet monsters, where hell had not yet been cast down, and where the roots of the world tree still trembled with rumors. Why did these myths survive in scraps? Why did the Vikings cling to images of giants lurking at the edges, of a dragon coiling under the earth, of twilight creeping closer every winter? And what do these fragments tell us, not just about the gods, but about the people who sang them, feared them, and lived by their echoes? This is not the story of Ragnarök itself. This is the story of the shadows before it, the forgotten Norse myths, the secrets before the end. Imagine the world not as we see it today, but as the Norse once described it. 9 realms connected by the vast ash tree Yggdrasil. At the top, Asgard, the home of the gods. In the middle, Midgard, the realm of men, ringed by oceans. Below, Niflheim, the land of ice and mist. And further still, the domains of fire, giants, and shadows. Every myth carried a piece of this cosmic map, yet many were left half-told. A verse scratched into stone, a line in the Poetic Edda, a rumor that reached Iceland but never became canon. In these fragments live some of the strangest tales. How a serpent encircled the sea long before it fought Thor. How hell once walked freely among the living. How the dwarves shaped destinies with runes of iron and bone. We will wander into those forgotten places tonight. We will trace the older threads, compare them with the stories of Celts, Greeks, and even the myths of Siberia, where shamans spoke of wolves that devoured the moon. And as we follow the trail, a question will remain. Why did the Norse hold on to these images so fiercely? What secret fear or truth did they embody? The story begins not with the gods at war, but with silence, with the nothingness the skalds called Ginnungagap, a yawning void, darker than any night, stretching between 2 extremes, the realm of fire to the south and the realm of ice to the north. From that meeting of opposites came the first forms, a giant of frost, a cow of primeval milk, rivers that carried sparks of life. It is here that the forgotten threads begin, because not every creature born of that chaos survived into the well-known sagas. Some were erased, others merged with later Christian images, and a few remain only in stray kennings, poetic riddles left by skalds who may have known more than they revealed. One such shadow is the figure of the Nigr, the dragon that gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil. Today we imagine it as a symbol of corruption, waiting for the end. But according to some older songs, Nigr was once a guardian, a creature that fed not on roots, but on fallen oaths, punishing those who betrayed sacred bonds. How did a guardian become a destroyer? What shift in story turned protector into devourer? This is the kind of forgotten question that lingers in the margins. There are others. The goddess Hel, ruler of the underworld, is remembered as half-living, half-dead, a daughter cast away by Odin. But in certain Icelandic folktales, she appears not as a ruler of shadows, but as a healer, a liminal being who could walk between the living and the dead. Was she feared? Or was she, at first, honored as a bridge, a guide? Only later did she become the outcast queen of the grave. Even the great serpent, Jormungandr, has an earlier shape. We think of it only as Thor's nemesis, the world serpent lying in the ocean's depths until the day of doom. Yet some of the oldest kennings describe it not as an enemy, but as the boundary itself. The serpent was the ocean. Its body was the horizon. To fight it was not simply to battle a beast, but to challenge the very limit of the world. These fragments tell us something profound. The Norse did not imagine a stable, safe cosmos. Their myths are filled with edges, borders, cracks where danger seeps in. And the forgotten stories, the ones before Ragnarök, remind us that the end was always coming. Not suddenly, but slowly, in the erosion of oaths, in the quiet spread of chaos. So tonight, as we journey through these myths, we will listen carefully to what survived in whispers. We will ask, why did they imagine hell's face as both alive and dead? Why did they dream of wolves that swallowed sun and moon? Why did they fear that even the world tree could rot from beneath? The promise is this: by the end of this journey, you will see the Norse myths not as frozen museum pieces, but as living echoes, stories that carried meaning through winters of hunger, through voyages into unknown seas, through moments when life itself felt fragile. And perhaps you will see why these myths still call to us today, in an age where the end of the world is imagined in new forms, but the fears remain strangely familiar. To understand the forgotten Norse myths, we must first step into the world that gave them life. The myths were not created in isolation, but born of a harsh geography, a restless climate, and a people whose daily survival shaped their imagination. Picture Scandinavia in the first millennium, a land of long winters, short summers, forests stretching like dark walls, and seas that swallowed ships as easily as they carried them. For those who lived here, the world was not gentle. It was raw, unpredictable, and alive with forces beyond human control. The Norse saw in nature both a threat and a teacher. The storms that wrecked their boats were not merely weather, but the wrath of a giant or the breath of a god. The aurora borealis, streaking across the polar night, became the armor of Valkyries riding to battle. The endless winter darkness was not just a lack of light. It was the approach of wolves chasing the sun. This landscape produced people who were farmers, hunters, sailors, and raiders in equal measure. Their worldview was not built in stone temples or golden palaces, but in halls of wood, firesides where skalds sang, and journeys across the sea. The myths reflect this, not distant gods high above, but deities who feasted, fought, and fell, much like the people themselves. The society that told these stories was layered. At its heart were the jarls, chieftains who ruled small territories. Around them, the carls, free farmers and warriors. Below them, thralls, slaves taken in raids or born into servitude. Each class heard the same myths, but perhaps with different ears. To a jarl, Odin's hunger for wisdom mirrored his own need for power. To a farmer, Thor's hammer defending the fields from frost giants was a promise that the crops might survive the season. Yet even across these layers, one truth remained. Fate was inescapable. The Norse called it Wyrd, the weaving of destiny by unseen hands. Life was not a ladder to climb endlessly upward, but a thread measured and cut. And this shaped their myths. Heroes knew they would die. Even the gods knew their doom, but glory came in how one faced it. Archaeology adds detail to this worldview. Burial mounds in Sweden show warriors laid to rest with weapons, horses, and even ships, as if to journey into another realm. Carvings on stones depict serpents winding around worlds, wolves chasing celestial bodies, women with outstretched arms, perhaps Valkyries or goddesses unknown. These images, scratched into rock, preserve fragments of stories that never made it into the later sagas. We also must remember that Norse mythology was not uniform. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland each carried their own flavors. Coastal communities emphasized sea serpents, storms, and tales of drowned gods. Inland farmers imagined land spirits, elves in the woods, and giants dwelling in mountains. The myths were alive, changing with the people who told them. And while we often speak of Norse mythology as if it were one book, in truth it was a patchwork quilt. The Poetic Edda and Prose Edda, our main sources today, were written down in Iceland only in the 13th century, long after Christianity had arrived. By then, many older versions had already vanished. What remains are shadows, and it is in those shadows that the forgotten myths linger. Consider Hel again. In the Eddas, she is cold and distant, half-rotting, ruling a realm of those who died without glory. But folk traditions across Scandinavia remembered her differently. In some, she was a spirit who walked the roads, warning travelers of danger. In others, she was tied to fertility, a paradoxical figure who both ended and renewed life. Only later did she become the pale queen of death we think of today. Or think of Jormungandr, the serpent in the sea. The Icelandic coast was notorious for storms and whirlpools. Fishermen likely whispered of a serpent beneath the waves long before poets made it the son of Loki. The myth and the landscape fed one another. The serpent explained the sea, and the sea gave weight to the serpent. The Norse also borrowed and reshaped. From the Celts came echoes of otherworldly islands and enchanted cauldrons. From the Sami, indigenous reindeer herders of the north, came shamanic visions of traveling between worlds. From Germanic tribes further south came warlike gods and sacred runes. The Norse wove all of this into their tapestry, a tapestry where giants and elves stood side by side, and every mountain, river, or storm could house a story. One of the most striking features of their worldview is how close the divine and the mortal were. Unlike the distant gods of Olympus, the Aesir and Vanir walked among humans, ate and drank, bargained and fought. The boundary between myth and daily life was porous. A farmer might pour ale on the ground for Thor before planting. A sailor might carve runes on his boat to call on Jord, god of the sea. These were not abstract figures, but companions in survival. And survival was always uncertain. Winters could starve a family. Raids could wipe out a village. Disease could strike without warning. Against this backdrop, myths became both explanation and reassurance. If the wolf swallowed the sun, it was not random, it was fate. If giants brought frost, Thor would fight them. If death came, one's deeds would echo in song. This is the world from which the forgotten myths emerged. A world of harsh beauty, where light was brief, seas were endless, and the line between life and death was thin. A world where every stone might whisper of giants, every storm might carry the voice of a god, and every winter night might feel like the beginning of Ragnarök itself. It is in this world that the first versions of these myths were born, and from here they spread, carried by long ships across seas, by merchants on trade routes, by skalds in smoky halls. What survived became the stories we know. What was lost? Those are the fragments we now seek to recover. Before the Norse myths were ever written in vellum or carved into stone, they lived on the tongues of poets. Oral tradition was the lifeblood of the North. Long before scribes in Iceland shaped the Eddas, the stories existed as songs, fluid, shifting, alive. Imagine a longhouse in winter. Smoke curling to the rafters, torches flickering on wooden walls, the smell of mead thick in the air. At the center stands a skald, the poet. His voice carries rhythm like waves, his verses wrapped in kennings, riddling metaphors that made the ordinary mysterious. He does not say Thor's hammer. He calls it the crusher of giants, or the lightning bearer. He does not say the sea. He calls it the whale road, or the serpent's girdle. Through these kennings, myths passed from ear to ear. No two performances were the same. A skald might stretch one story into hours, weaving side tales, or condense a saga into a handful of riddles. Memory and creativity danced together, and so the myths shifted with each retelling. This explains why fragments survive. A dragon at the root of a tree, a wolf chasing the moon, a goddess with two faces. They appear in passing, in a single verse, as if the audience already knew the rest. But as centuries passed, some of those known stories faded, leaving only clues. The earliest written traces we have are not even Norse. Roman historians like Tacitus, writing in the 1st century, described Germanic tribes who worshipped deities of war and fertility, who sang before battle, who believed in sacred groves. Some of these accounts align with later Norse figures, Tyr, Freya, Odin. Others hint at gods we no longer recognize. Tacitus mentions Nerthus, a goddess of the earth who rode in a chariot across the land, honored with festivals. By the Viking Age, Nerthus had all but vanished. Perhaps she was reshaped into Njord, god of the sea. Perhaps she lingered in folk rites under another name. Runic inscriptions also offer whispers. Carved into stones and weapons, the runes carried both words and magic. Some invoke Tyr, asking for victory. Others speak of giants or of Odin's gift of wisdom. Yet the runes are brief, never telling the full tale. They are markers, reminders, like shorthand for stories already known. When Christianity reached the North, many of these oral traditions were written down for the first time, ironically, by Christian scribes. In Iceland, Snorri Sturluson compiled the Prose Edda in the 13th century, partly to preserve the poetic craft of skalds. But by then, the old beliefs were already fading, and Snorri reshaped them through a Christian lens. He explained the gods not as true divinities, but as noble ancestors later worshipped as gods. This euhemerism softened the pagan past for Christian readers, but it also distorted the myths. Yet in this very distortion, we find signs of older layers. For instance, in Snorri's account, Hel is monstrous, half-blue, half-flesh, banished by Odin. But some scholars believe Snorri emphasized her horror to align with Christian notions of hell. Folk tradition may have remembered her differently, not as punishment, but as inevitability, a place where all went, not just the wicked. Another example is Jormungandr. In Christian imagery, serpents often symbolize sin or the devil. Snorri frames the world serpent as a force of doom, fated to kill Thor. But earlier verses hint at something broader, Jormungandr as the very boundary of the world. That older idea feels less like evil and more like cosmology. The oral tradition also explains the strange multiplicity of Norse myths. There was no single canon. In one village, a giant might be a villain. In another, the same giant might be a teacher. Loki in one story is the trickster who helps the gods, in another the betrayer who dooms them. This fluidity reflects the oral world. Myths were tools, adjusted for context, told for entertainment, ritual, or warning. There are also traces of translation, moments when Norse myths crossed cultural borders. Merchants in the Baltic would have heard Slavic tales of Perrin, the thunder god, and compared him to Thor. Vikings in Ireland would have heard of the Tuatha Danann, a race of shining beings, and perhaps merged them with their own elves. In Russia, encounters with Finno-Ugric peoples introduced myths of shamans who traveled to the underworld, not unlike Odin's own descent. All of these influences braided together. The myths we read today are only one version of that braid, caught at a particular moment. Beneath it lie older strands, and beneath those, perhaps even more ancient ones shared by Indo-European peoples long before the Norse existed. One striking example of these ancient echoes is the chaos serpent. Cultures across the world told of a great serpent or dragon embodying chaos. In Mesopotamia, Tiamat. In Greece, Typhon. In India, Vritra. Among the Norse, Jormungandr. The pattern suggests a very old archetype, passed down and reshaped for each people. The Norse gave theirs a home in the sea and tied it to Thor, but the echo stretches across continents. In the same way, the wolf Fenrir reflects a wider fear of untamed wildness. Wolves in northern Europe were not distant creatures. They prowled the edges of villages, took livestock, sometimes even threatened people. To bind Fenrir was to imagine controlling that terror. But the myth insists the binding would break. The wild could never be fully tamed. This blend of oral memory, cultural borrowing, and archetypal patterns created a mythos that was never fixed, never final. It was always in motion, and in that motion, some stories slipped through the cracks. A giantess whose name survives in one stanza. A feast where gods bargained with dwarves, but no one recalls the outcome. A mysterious goddess who walked the earth in spring, then vanished from the record. These are the forgotten myths, the ones that lurk between the lines, waiting for us to notice their shadows. At the heart of Norse mythology stand its characters, gods, giants, beasts, and beings who blurred the line between human and divine. To understand the forgotten myths, we must look not only at the figures we know, Odin, Thor, Loki, but also at those who appear briefly, then fade into silence. These lesser-known figures often carry clues to the older layers of the mythos. The most famous are, of course, the Aesir. Odin, All-Father, seeker of wisdom, the one-eyed wanderer who traded sight for knowledge. Thor, Thunderer, defender of mankind, whose hammer Mjolnir rang with the force of storms. Frigg, goddess of foresight and motherhood. Tyr, god of law and sacrifice. These figures dominate the written sources, but surrounding them are others, equally fascinating. Consider the Vanir, a rival group of gods associated with fertility, nature, and prosperity. Njord, god of the sea, winds, and wealth. His children, Freyr and Freya, embodying abundance and love, beauty and desire, fertility and magic. The war between Aesir and Vanir, ending in uneasy truce, suggests that Norse mythology preserved memories of cultural fusion, perhaps older fertility cults merging with warrior cults. The forgotten myths often live in this tension, where one set of deities was not erased, but reinterpreted. The giants, or Jotnar, are often painted as enemies. Yet in many stories, they are also teachers, lovers, even ancestors of the gods themselves. Odin learned wisdom from giantesses. Thor's strength was tested by giants who tricked him with illusions. Loki himself was born of giant blood, yet lived among the gods until his betrayal. This ambivalence, giant as foe and kin, reveals a worldview where chaos was not entirely outside, but woven into creation itself. Some of the most intriguing figures are the ones who barely appear. Take the goddess Jefjun, who plowed the island of Zealand from the soil of Sweden with the help of her giant-born oxen. She is mentioned briefly in Snorri's Edda, but scholars suspect she once held a much larger role, perhaps as a fertility goddess tied to land and agriculture. Her disappearance from the major myths may reflect changing priorities in society. As warrior gods rose in prominence, agricultural deities faded into the background. Then there is Sif, Thor's golden-haired wife. Today she is remembered mainly because Loki cut her hair, forcing the dwarves to craft a magical replacement. But why did she have golden hair to begin with? Some suggest it symbolized fields of wheat, tying her to fertility and harvest. If so, Sif may have once been more than a background figure, perhaps a goddess of the earth, diminished in the surviving stories. Hel, as we've noted, is another liminal figure. In some traditions she is monstrous, in others, she is fair but solemn. She may reflect a very old Indo-European archetype, the goddess who rules the realm of the dead without moral judgment, unlike the Christian heaven and hell. Her dual appearance, half flesh, half corpse, echoes the duality of life and death. Among animals and symbols, the Norse imagination was rich. Wolves, serpents, ravens, and horses appear constantly. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, fly across the world each day to bring him news. Sleipnir, his eight-legged horse, carries him between realms, a reminder of shamanic traditions where a steed carried the soul to other worlds. The wolf Fenrir embodies wild destruction, but also inevitability, a creature bound by gods, yet destined to break free. These archetypes are not uniquely Norse. They echo across cultures. The Greeks, too, had a father of gods obsessed with knowledge, Zeus, who feared prophecy. The Hindus had Indra, a thunder god who battled serpents. The Celts had Morrigan, a goddess of fate and death, not unlike Hel. Such parallels remind us that myths are not isolated inventions, but part of a larger human attempt to make sense of nature and mortality. What sets the Norse characters apart is their fragility. Even the gods are not immortal in the absolute sense. They can be wounded, tricked, even killed. They are powerful, but not invincible. This makes them strangely human, closer to the listeners who prayed to them. Odin knows he will die at Ragnarök, yet he seeks wisdom anyway. Thor knows the serpent will kill him, yet he raises his hammer. Their greatness lies not in escaping fate, but in facing it with courage. The forgotten characters add depth to this theme. Take the Norns, the weavers of fate. They appear rarely, often in the background, tending Yggdrasil, carving runes. But their presence is immense. They are beyond gods, beyond giants. Even Odin bows to their weaving. They suggest that behind all stories lies something greater, the inevitability of destiny, silent and unshaken. Or take the dwarves, master smiths who crafted not only Thor's hammer, but countless treasures. They are sometimes tricksters, sometimes helpers, sometimes darker figures. In older traditions, dwarves were tied to the earth itself, spirits of stone and soil. Over time, they became more like craftsmen. In the gaps of these shifts, we glimpse older layers of myth, now half lost. Even Loki resists easy categorization. Trickster, shapeshifter, father of monsters, companion of gods. He helps and betrays in equal measure. His origins are giant-born, yet he sits among the Aesir. Some scholars see in him a memory of older fire spirits, or a reflection of shamanic tricksters, known across Siberia and North America. The forgotten Loki is not only the betrayer of Ragnarök, but also the one who ensured the gods had their greatest treasures by trickery and wager. Taken together, these figures reveal a mythology of balance, not simple good versus evil, but a web of forces, some creative, some destructive, all necessary. The forgotten myths remind us that no character was one-dimensional. Giants were kin as well as foes. Hell was healer as well as doom. The serpent was boundary as well as threat. In their complexity, the Norse characters mirror the world itself, unpredictable, contradictory, dangerous, and yet meaningful. Among the many threads that wove the Norse imagination, one story lingers on the edge of memory, a tale told in fragments, half hidden in kennings, scattered across folk songs and later reassembled by scholars. It is not the Battle of Ragnarök, but a smaller, stranger conflict that sets the stage for that final doom. It begins with the binding of Fenrir. Most know the broad outline. The gods raised the wolf, child of Loki, in Asgard. He grew larger each day, until fear spread through the halls. They tried to bind him with chains, but Fenrir broke them with ease. Finally, the dwarves forged a magical fetter, Gleipnir, spun from impossible things. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain. The wolf sensed a trick and demanded one of the gods place a hand in his mouth as pledge of good faith. Tyr stepped forward, and when the fetter held, Fenrir bit off his hand. The wolf remained bound until Ragnarök, when he would break free. But beneath this familiar tale lies a forgotten layer. Some verses suggest that before Fenrir was bound, there was another confrontation, a trial of oaths, not strength. The gods did not immediately seek to bind him. They first tried to tame him through words. According to an older fragment, preserved in a single Icelandic manuscript, the gods swore oaths to Fenrir, promises that if he lived peacefully, he would inherit a realm of his own. Some versions hint at a pasture or sacred land, others at a hall on the edge of the worlds. In return, the wolf swore not to harm the Aesir. But oaths were dangerous things in Norse culture. To break them brought dishonor not only on the speaker, but on the fabric of the cosmos itself. This is where the story shifts. The gods, fearful of prophecy, broke their word. They deceived the wolf, offering false comfort while plotting his capture. In this light, Fenrir is not merely a beast destined to destroy, but a betrayed ally. His rage at Ragnarök is fueled not only by fate, but by broken trust. The forgotten tale adds weight to Tyr's role. He was not simply the brave god who sacrificed his hand. He was also the god of law, the one who bound oaths. To place his hand in the wolf's mouth was more than courage. It was acknowledgement that the gods had deceived. His hand was the price of their broken promises. This version changes how we see the myth. It is not a simple story of good gods binding an evil monster. It becomes a tragedy of mistrust, where both sides play their part. The gods, driven by fear. The wolf, driven by hunger and betrayal. Tyr, caught between law and loyalty. We find echoes of this story across other Indo-European myths. In Greek legend, Prometheus is punished not for violence, but for breaking the boundary between gods and men by giving fire. In Hindu stories, Indra slays Vritra the serpent not only through strength, but through deception, breaking the rules of fair battle. In each, the cosmic order is preserved through an act that is itself morally fragile. The Norse, too, seem to have wrestled with this paradox. Another fragment, this time from a skaldic poem, suggests Fenrir's chains were not just physical. The fetter Gleipnir was tied to the roots of Yggdrasil itself, binding the wolf to the cosmic order. His struggle shook the world tree, causing tremors felt across the 9 realms. In this sense, Fenrir's binding was not simply containment, but a wound in the fabric of creation, a reminder that the gods themselves had bent truth to hold back chaos. Imagine hearing this tale by firelight. It would not only entertain, but also warn. Oaths were sacred in Norse society, sworn on rings, weapons, or the very gods themselves. To break one was to risk disaster. The story of Fenrir reminded listeners that even the gods could falter, and when they did, the cost was immense. The later, simplified version, where Fenrir is simply a beast bound until the end, may have suited Christian scribes better, aligning the wolf with sin or the devil. But the older whispers show us something different, a myth where trust was tested, betrayed, and paid for in blood. In that forgotten conflict lies a lesson as powerful as any saga. Sometimes the end of the world begins not with open war, but with the breaking of a promise. If the binding of Fenrir showed us how a single myth could hide layers of betrayal and fate, the next story reveals how myths splintered across regions, changing shape depending on who told them. Among the most fascinating is the tale of Baldr, the shining god whose death set the world on its path to Ragnarök. The official version, preserved in the Prose Edda, is familiar. Baldr, son of Odin and Frigg, was beloved by all. He dreamed of his own death, and his mother sought to protect him by extracting oaths from every creature, plant, and stone never to harm him. Only mistletoe, too young and small to be sworn upon, was overlooked. Loki fashioned a dart from mistletoe and placed it in the hand of Baldr's blind brother Hr, guiding him to throw it. The dart struck true, and Baldr fell. The gods tried to ransom him back from hell, but Loki sabotaged the plan, and so the god of light remained in the underworld until the end. But older and regional versions complicate this story. In one Danish account, Baldr is not a god of light, but a warrior prince, slain in battle by a rival. His death sparked feuds among chieftains, echoing the real-world conflicts of Viking Age politics. Here, the myth becomes less cosmic and more human, grounding divine tragedy in the familiar cycle of honor and revenge. In Saxo Grammaticus Gesta Danorum, written in the 12th century, Baldr is portrayed not as a radiant figure of innocence, but as a demigod who fights for love and is struck down by a mortal hero. This version strips away the magical oaths and mistletoe, replacing them with the jealous rivalries of kings and warriors. It suggests that the Baldr myth may have been reshaped over time, moving from historical memory into mythic grandeur, then written back again as a saga of war. There are also whispers of Baldr in folk traditions that cast him not as victim, but as redeemer. In certain Icelandic verses, his death is framed not as permanent, but as a journey. Baldr waits in hell not merely as prisoner, but as one who will return after Ragnarök to rule a renewed world. This echoes into European patterns, where the dying god represents both loss and renewal, much like Osiris in Egypt or Dionysus in Greece. The forgotten layers of Baldr's story deepen when we consider his relationship with Hel. In the familiar version, Hel refuses to release him because one giantess, often said to be Loki in disguise, does not weep for his death. But in some folk retellings, Hel herself mourns Baldr. She offers him hospitality and comfort, not punishment. In this reading, the underworld is not a place of torment, but of waiting. Hel becomes a caretaker of what must one day be reborn. These variations show us the flexibility of myth. To some, Baldr's death explained why even the brightest light could not escape fate. To others, it mirrored the feuds and tragedies of their own communities. To still others, it was a promise of return, a reminder that from death could come renewal. The forgotten myths also offer alternative versions of Loki's role. In some stories, he does not directly guide Hr's hand. Instead, the gods themselves test Baldr's invulnerability with weapons and stones, and it is by chance that mistletoe proves fatal. Here, Loki is not the sole architect of tragedy, but merely one of many forces in a cosmos where fate is inescapable. This softer version perhaps reflects older traditions, where Loki was less villain and more trickster, a necessary disruptor, not a final betrayer. Across the Norse world, local variations like these were common. A farmer in rural Sweden might tell of elves blessing crops, while a sailor in Norway would speak of sea spirits dragging ships under. In Iceland, volcanic eruptions and endless winters gave rise to darker visions of doom, while in Denmark, stories often leaned toward political allegory. Baldr's death is the perfect example of how one myth could serve many purposes. For some, it explained cosmic decline. For others, it mirrored the fall of great leaders. For still others, it hinted at resurrection. Each version preserved a fragment of truth for its listeners. And so we must remember, Norse mythology was not a single book, but a living conversation across centuries. Its forgotten versions are not errors, but windows into the shifting needs of the people who told them. Norse mythology is full of battles and gods, but beneath those stories lies a dense web of symbols. Every animal, number, and natural element carried meaning, not only for the skalds who recited the sagas, but for the listeners who shaped their world through these images. The forgotten myths, in particular, are rich with such symbols, often preserved in fragments even when the fuller stories vanished. Animals spoke first. The wolf is perhaps the most famous, Fenrir, the devourer, whose jaws threaten sky and earth. But wolves appear in other roles too. Odin himself is flanked by two wolves, Jerry and Freki, who sit at his side during feasts. Unlike Fenrir, these wolves represent loyalty, hunger, and the bond between ruler and wildness. In folk tales, wolves were both feared predators and admired hunters. Thus the wolf symbol carried dual weight, destruction on one hand, companionship on the other. Serpents, too, played a central role. Jormungandr, coiling the seas, embodies the horizon, the edge of the world. Nigr gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil, a constant reminder that even the world tree decays. Yet snakes were not only destructive. They shed their skins, symbolizing renewal. Some folk beliefs considered them guardians of hidden treasures, curled in burial mounds. The serpent, like the wolf, was never one thing. It was boundary, corruption, protection, and transformation all at once. Ravens were Odin's companions, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, but they were also battlefield birds, feeding on the slain. To see ravens circling after combat was to witness Odin's presence. In poetry, ravens symbolized both wisdom and death, a reminder that knowledge often comes at a cost. Horses carried similar duality. Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged steed, moved between worlds, a shamanic symbol of spirit travel. But common horses were also sacrificed in rituals, their blood used to sanctify sacred sites. For the Norse, the horse bridged the ordinary and the divine, daily work and cosmic passage. Even smaller animals bore meaning. Cats, sacred to Freya, symbolized cunning and independence. Goats, pulling Thor's chariot, represented strength and resilience. Stags leaping across Yggdrasil fed upon its branches, their horns dripping dew into rivers. Each creature in the mythic bestiary reflected an aspect of life, fertility, danger, wisdom, or endurance. Numbers, too, carried symbolic weight. 3 was sacred, appearing in the 3 Norns who wove fate, the 3 roots of Yggdrasil, the 3 realms often visited in myth. 9 was even more powerful. Odin hung 9 nights on the world tree to gain wisdom. The 9 worlds formed the structure of the cosmos. Multiples of 9 often appear in rituals and poetry, suggesting a number that encompassed completeness and cosmic order. Objects were equally symbolic. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was not only a weapon but a tool of consecration. It blessed marriages, fields, and even funerals. To wield the hammer was to protect not just through force, but through sanctity. Odin's spear, Gungnir, was said never to miss its mark, a symbol of inevitability, of fate striking true. The mead of poetry, brewed from the blood of a wise being, symbolized inspiration itself, a reminder that art and sacrifice were inseparable. Natural elements anchored everything. Ice and fire were the primal opposites from which the cosmos was born. Together they formed Ginnungagap, the yawning void. Water carried both life and destruction. Seas as vast as serpents, rivers flowing from sacred wells, storms swallowing ships. Stone, carved with runes, carried memory across centuries. Trees symbolized life itself, Yggdrasil towering as the axis of all things, while smaller sacred groves served as meeting points with the divine. Colors carried subtle meanings. White and gold often symbolized light, purity, or divine power, seen in Baldr's shining figure or in Sif's golden hair. Red evoked blood, sacrifice, and vitality, echoing through battles and rituals. Black and blue, tied to hell and the underworld, symbolized death but also transition, not only an end but a threshold. Symbols often overlapped across cultures. The Norse wolf mirrors Greek tales of Lycaon and the Roman she-wolf, who raised Romulus and Remus. The serpent echoes dragons from Mesopotamia to China. The world tree resembles the cosmic trees of Siberian shamans and the Indian Ashvatha. Such parallels suggest shared archetypes, shaped differently by each culture, but pointing to universal human concerns: order, chaos, death, renewal. What makes Norse symbolism unique is its constant tension. Nothing is purely good or evil. Wolves protect and destroy. Serpents guard and corrupt. Even the gods' treasures carry danger. Thor's hammer defends, but it also brings storms. This ambivalence reflects the Norse view of life, a world of balance, where every gift carries a cost, every oath carries a risk. The forgotten myths often preserve these symbols in their rawest form. A stanza about a stag drinking from Yggdrasil, a charm invoking Thor's goats for fertility, a riddle describing the boundary that coils around the world. These fragments may seem small, but they reveal the symbolic structure beneath the sagas. To the Norse, symbols were not decoration. They were the language of existence. By telling stories of wolves, serpents, trees, and numbers, they explained not only their gods but their world. And in those symbols, even when the stories fade, meaning endures. Though centuries have passed since the last skald sang in a Viking hall, the Norse myths never truly disappeared. They linger in language, ritual, and imagination, reshaped again and again until they became part of our everyday world. Even the forgotten strands, faint in the sagas, echo today in ways we sometimes fail to notice. Start with the days of the week. In English, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday all carry Norse origins. Tuesday is Tyr's day, for the god who lost his hand to Fenrir. Wednesday is Odin's day, from Woden, the Anglo-Saxon form of his name. Thursday is Thor's day, the thunderer still stamping his presence on our calendars. Friday, often tied to Frigg or Freya, preserves the memory of the goddesses of love and foresight. In each case, fragments of forgotten myths still structure how we measure time itself. Festivals, too, keep the echoes alive. Midwinter celebrations in Scandinavia, once honoring Yule, survive in Christmas traditions. The burning of logs, the feasting, even the evergreen tree all carried symbolic weight in Norse winter rites. Promises of life returning after darkness. Midsummer bonfires, still lit in parts of northern Europe, recall the sun's power and the fear of its decline, tied to myths of wolves chasing sun and moon. Even in language, the kennings survive. Poets may not call the sea the whale road anymore, but phrases like storm of swords or hall of fire trace their roots to skaldic invention. The style of twisting words into riddles influenced not only medieval literature, but modern fantasy and song. The forgotten myths resurface most clearly in folk tradition. In rural Iceland and Norway, belief in elves and hidden people persisted for centuries. Roads were sometimes built around certain rocks, said to house spirits. Farmers left offerings to Landvetter, landwights, echoing older practices, where every field or mountain carried a presence. These beings do not appear much in the formal Eddas, but they reflect the same mythic worldview, that the world was alive, populated with unseen forces. In modern times, Norse myths found new life through art and literature. The 19th century revival of interest in Viking heritage brought forgotten stories back into the spotlight. Painters depicted Odin as a brooding wanderer. Wagner wove Valkyries into operas, and scholars pieced together fragments to reconstruct lost tales. The old myths, half remembered, became symbols of cultural identity. Then came the 20th century, when Norse mythology leapt into global pop culture. Tolkien drew deeply from these sources. Gandalf's resemblance to Odin the Wanderer, Middle-earth's elves shaped by Norse Alfr, the very concept of a world threatened by shadow-echoing Ragnarök. From there, fantasy literature and games carried the torch. Dungeons and Dragons borrowed freely from Norse monsters and cosmology. Video games like Skyrim and God of War turned Yggdrasil, Jormungandr, and the Nine Realms into digital landscapes. Marvel comics and films gave Thor and Loki new faces, reshaping them for a modern pantheon of superheroes. Yet even as these stories evolved, traces of the forgotten myths remained. Marvel's Loki is a trickster who resists easy classification, reflecting the older, less villainous versions. Tolkien's dragons, coiled in greed, mirror Niger beneath Yggdrasil. Games that use runes and charms often echo the very kennings once whispered in Viking halls. The persistence of these myths raises a question. Why do they endure when so many others faded? Part of the answer lies in their adaptability. Norse myths are not rigid commandments, but flexible tales, filled with ambiguity and contradiction. They invite retelling. They allow each age to find its own reflection in them, medieval skalds, romantic painters, modern filmmakers alike. But another part lies deeper. The themes of the myths, fate, betrayal, courage, renewal, remain universal. The fear that the world may end, the hope that something might rise again, the struggle to keep honor in the face of doom. These are not Viking concerns alone. They are human concerns. Even the forgotten fragments still resonate. The image of a dragon gnawing the roots of the world. How different is it from our modern fear that the foundations of nature itself are under strain? The story of hell as both healer and ruler. Does it not echo our own ambivalence toward death? Feared and yet accepted as natural? Each time we speak of twilight as doom, of wolves as danger, of storms as divine, we echo the voices of those long-ago skalds. The myths survive not as relics, but as part of how we imagine the world. And so, though the Viking Age ended 1,000 years ago, its stories live on. In our calendars, in our festivals, in our words and our art, the forgotten myths remain, quiet, persistent, waiting to be noticed. When we examine the forgotten Norse myths with the tools of history, anthropology, and psychology, their shape becomes clearer. Legends that seem fantastical at first glance often reflect lived experience, collective fears, or attempts to explain natural forces. By comparing myth to science, we can glimpse not only how these stories formed but why they endured. Anthropology reminds us that myths are not random inventions. They grow out of a society's environment and structure. For the Norse, this meant long winters, volatile seas, and fragile harvests. The wolf chasing the sun and moon may sound like fantasy, yet for a people who watch daylight vanish for months each year, it mirrored reality. When the sky darkened and cold deepened, it felt as if some creature truly pursued the sun into hiding. The serpent encircling the world, Jormungandr, can be read as a mythic expression of the ocean itself. For coastal communities, the horizon was both boundary and threat. To imagine a serpent whose coils created that boundary was to personify the vastness of the sea, a force too great for mortals to tame. Psychology deepens this view. Serpents are archetypal images of the unconscious, boundaries of fear and transformation. Carl Jung would later argue that Jormungandr is not only an ocean myth, but a symbol of the human struggle with limits, the line between order and chaos. Archaeology provides physical echoes. Rock carvings from Bronze Age Scandinavia depict ships, serpents, and figures with raised weapons, images that predate the Viking Age yet resonate with later myths. Burial finds show miniature hammers placed with the dead, suggesting Thor's protection carried into the afterlife. Runes inscribed on stones and amulets invoke gods, giants, or protective charms, reinforcing that myth was not abstract belief, but woven into daily practice. Comparative mythology adds another layer. The Norse were part of the larger Indo-European family of cultures, and many of their motifs parallel those of distant peoples. The chaos serpent appears in Mesopotamia, India, Greece. The cosmic tree, Yggdrasil, resembles the world trees of Siberian shamans and Native American traditions. The wolf as devourer appears in both Celtic and Slavic myth. These parallels suggest shared ancestral patterns, reshaped by each society's environment. But science also reminds us that myths were not only reflections of fear. They were tools for resilience. To imagine that Thor battled giants each time thunder rolled gave meaning to storms. To believe that fate was woven by the Norns offered a framework for life's unpredictability. Psychologically, myths reduce chaos by turning it into narrative. They do not remove danger, but they explain it. And in explaining, they empower. One of the most striking scientific insights is how myths preserve memory of real events. Volcanic eruptions in Iceland, floods along coasts, eclipses. These left deep impressions. The myth of the wolf devouring the sun mirrors the rare but terrifying spectacle of an eclipse. The ash and fire of eruptions resemble tales of Surtur, the fire giant, marching with his flaming sword. In this way, myths served as cultural memory, encoding disasters into stories that could be passed across generations. Even the forgotten fragments can be read in this light. Niger gnawing the roots of Yggdrasil may symbolize the constant decay of nature, the slow erosion of time. Hell's dual face, half life, half death, mirrors the human experience of death as both terrifying and necessary, the soil that ends but also feeds new growth. Baldr's death, in its alternative versions, reflects the universal pattern of the dying god, whose fall marks not only decline but also the promise of renewal. Modern psychology helps us understand why these myths still resonate. They embody archetypes: the trickster in Loki, the hero in Thor, the wise old wanderer in Odin, the devouring beast in Fenrir. These figures appear across cultures because they represent parts of the human psyche. The forgotten myths, when they show Loki helping instead of harming, or Hel as healer instead of monster, remind us that archetypes are fluid. Each side, light and dark, creation and destruction, belongs to the whole. Science cannot prove that giants walked the earth, or that gods wielded hammers of thunder, but it can show us why such images mattered, how they reflected both the natural world and the inner world. To dismiss myth as false misses the point. Myths were not meant as literal science. They were a language of meaning, a way to face the unknown. And so, even as archaeology and anthropology decode them, the myths retain power. For the Norse, they explained eclipses, storms, and fate. For us, they explain something just as vital: why humans tell stories at all. When we step back from the fragments, the symbols, the forgotten versions, a larger picture emerges. The Norse myths are not only stories of gods and monsters. They are mirrors of a people who lived on the edge of survival, who looked into the vastness of sea and sky and sought meaning. Their myths endured because they were never just entertainment. They were maps of existence, guiding how to live, how to endure, how to face the inevitable. The forgotten tales, Fenrir bound by broken oaths, Baldr mourned in many ways, Hel walking as both healer and ruler, remind us that mythology was never fixed. It shifted with time, with need, with the people who told it. To rediscover these hidden layers is to rediscover the creativity and complexity of those who shaped them. For the Norse, fate was certain. Even the gods would fall. Ragnarök was not a distant threat, but a truth woven into the fabric of life. Everything ends. Yet this was not a story of despair. It was a story of courage. Odin still sought wisdom, though he knew it would not save him. Thor still lifted his hammer, though he knew the serpent would strike him down. The skalds still sang, though they knew the night was long. That is the heart of these myths, not denial of doom, but defiance in the face of it. To live with honor, to keep oaths, to protect kin, to seek knowledge. These were the victories that mattered, even if the end was written. And perhaps this is why the myths still speak to us today. We no longer fear wolves devouring the sun, yet we face our own shadows, change, uncertainty, endings we cannot avoid. The forgotten myths remind us that meaning is not found in escaping fate, but in meeting it with strength. They tell us that betrayal carries consequence, that promises shape the world, that even in decay there is renewal. The image of Yggdrasil, the world tree, may be the best symbol of all. Its roots gnawed by serpents, its branches shaken by storms, yet it still stands. Life endures not because it is untouched, but because it persists despite the gnawing. So too did the Norse endure, and so too do we. When we hear these stories now, in books, films, or whispered fragments, we are not simply indulging in ancient fantasy. We are touching the same currents that guided sailors into dark seas, that gave hope in long winters, that made sense of loss and death. We are hearing humanity wrestle with the oldest questions. Why do we suffer? What gives life meaning? What remains after the end? The forgotten myths do not give simple answers, but they give images, powerful enough to survive 1,000 years. Images that still stir something in us. The serpent at the horizon, the wolf straining against his chains, the goddess with two faces, the shining god who falls, the tree that trembles but does not fall. And perhaps that is the true gift of these stories. Not certainty, but inspiration. Not escape, but courage. Not a denial of endings, but a reminder that even in twilight, light remains. So the next time thunder rolls, or winter lingers too long, or the horizon seems endless and uncertain, remember the forgotten Norse myths. Remember the gods who faced doom and chose to act anyway. Remember that every end carries a seed of beginning. The secrets before Ragnarök are not just tales of a vanished age. They are reminders that courage, trust, and meaning are ours to shape, even when the world trembles. And so the myths live on. In us, in the stories we tell, in the choices we make at the edge of our own horizons.